Hello everyone, and welcome to our first lecture in our lecture series that will take us through to February 28th. So today is our primer. We're going to be going through critical race theory, its origins, its genealogy, and different things of that sort. So let's go ahead and dive in. And by the way, as we move throughout this lecture series, I will be recommending text, right? So that way, if you want to know more about an issue, whether it be jurisprudence, meaning law, right? Whether it be historical, sociological, political, whatever have you, I'll be recommending other texts from time to time for you to check out in your free time and to read so that you have more information on the issue. So let's go ahead and get into it. So what are we going to be going over today, just so that we have our foundation set for our next 4 weeks together? So we're going to be going over terminology, the founding philosopher, academic in the academic and social genealogy of critical race theory, key arguments in the field, why critical race theory matters to the nation state, as well as key theorists in the field. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to break down each word in terms of how we should be thinking about it and what it means so that we are clear. So let's first start with getting to what we mean by critical, and I'm leaning on Patricia Hill Collins to inform some of these definitions here. So the first thing in what we mean by critical within critical race theory is something that is essential or important to a thing, to a being, right? To a thought, to a law. We want to look at that thing that is seen as essential or important, that this does not exist without this. Right? We're going to look at that. We're going to engage whatever that essential or important thing is. The next thing that we mean by when we say critical is critical as a critique or criticizing ideas and or social problems. So whether it be houselessness, right? Whether it be income inequality, whether it be pay inequality, whether it has to deal with social issues for those who are undocumented, etc. Critical within the context of critical race theory can also be seen as, or can also be understood as critiquing or criticizing ideas and or social problems, right? So we will look at that. The next thing that we do as well within the meaning of critical is we mean critical as being actively analytically engaged. What does that mean? That means that we are looking at law, we are looking at public policy, we are looking at statutes, and we are reading it line by line, word by word. We're looking at whether that is a period, whether that is a comma, whether it's a semicolon, whatever have you, right? We're going to break that down because there is a huge difference between and or, right? So if a law says this and this means this versus this or this means this. One is contingent upon both elements. Another is contingent upon one of the two. And so that's going to be important when we are looking at law and how it informs social issues and outcomes and different things of that sort, right? So again, when we say being actively analytically engaged, we are talking about quite literally line by line. We're not just, reading just to read. We're reading each word because words have meaning and they impact society, which is what I would like for you to do throughout our journey together, right? That you be actively, analytically engaged in the text that you are reading and that you allow the text to challenge you as well as you challenging the text. So as you are reading, you should be having a conversation with yourself and with the text. So that way you are expanding your boundaries, right? Your intellectual and ideological moorings, so that you can see, okay, how might this apply to me, or how might I want to adapt this moving forward in the future, right? Lastly, we also look at critical within critical race theory as challenging the assumptions and exclusions of the prevailing conceptual, theoretical, or analytical framework of a discourse or discipline. That's a whole lot of words just to say we look at what supports a particular conversation or a belief that informs it, and we get at that belief. What are the necessary elements or the essential or important parts of that particular belief and what informs that belief, and we pull that apart, meaning that we look at the substructures of a thing, right? So an example, if I could give you an example, we would say, okay, well, red means stop. Okay, well, who came up with red? Why is red stopped and not purple? Why are we using that, right? So critical race theorists, we go into the weeds of it, and we get down in the substructures to say, okay, you say this about this, but what informs that? Another relevant real-time example, let's look at the phrase or the paradigm of make America great again. Okay, what is meant by that? What ideologies are informing that, and what are the substructures that inform those ideologies? That is what critical race theorists are going to do. They're going to challenge the assumptions of a belief systems, and they're also going to challenge the exclusions within that belief system. So in this particular example, if one is saying make America great again, not only are we going to challenge the assumptions that is automatically embedded within make America great again, but we're also going to challenge what is excluded and why it's excluded. And that is what we mean by critical within critical race theory. Okay? Next up, we are going to look at what do we mean by race within critical race theory. And race here takes on a different meaning for us as critical race theorists, because we are looking at race as a socio-political classification system that is socially constructed to distinguish groups of people and to determine the distribution of power and life-sustaining resources, right? So in this case, we are saying that race is not just some neutral thing, but that race has capacity and authority to do certain things in society, such as the distribution of resources in a community. In other words, we look at how race may inform why one grocery store looks like this on one side of town and why a grocery store looks like this on another side of town, why a school receives so much funding on this side of town and why other schools don't, why homes are valued and appraised more on this side of town versus why they're not on the other side of town, and that we explore that and how race may inform those particular things. So just like money, just like gender, and there's a difference between gender and sex, but that's not this class, right? But money, gender, race, etc. are all socially constructed. These things are not naturally occurring within nature, right? That race had to be made. Now, if this was one of the history courses that I would normally teach, I would walk you through the creation of race and how we got there, but that's not what we're doing here. So the main point being here is to understand that critical race theorists see and interpret race as having a type of capacity, a type of job to do within society, that it is a technology of the nation state that gets at a certain thing, that does a certain things, that allows for certain outcomes to take place. Okay. Lastly, we also look at theory. And what do we mean by theory? What is theory? What we are simply saying, sorry about my locks there. What we are simply saying is that when it comes to theory, is that theory is a systemic set of ideas and statements about the world, or in other words, paradigms which work to define the world we live in, as well as give meanings to symbols, objects, and characteristics. In other words, a set of ideas that informs what you see. Okay? So when you see that, again, when you see red, you know, and it's on a red light, you mean stop. Yellow means proceed with caution, right? Green means go. And what we do is we look at the paradigms that informs those colors, to use that particular example again. So when we put all of those things together, these are the definitions behind the terms, quite literally the words, critical race theory. So when we put it all together, what is critical race theory in terms of an academic discipline? It is an interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and multidisciplinary study of race, land, and society, and interrogates the presumed neutrality of law and life in the United States and the world more broadly. So not only are we looking at race, we're going to be looking at land as well. This is particularly important for Native and Indigenous folks. And then we look at society as a whole. But race is really the central axis upon which the other two rely upon, right? But the key thing in this line, in this particular definition to understand of critical race theory, is that we look at the presumed neutrality of law. because law is not neutral. Right? That's one of the things that's one of the main tenets of dealing with critical race theory. We all have to understand that law is a social construction, and as such, it is not neutral. It has an effect, it does a thing, it has a purpose, right? And just to give you a little bit of insight, when we say interdisciplinary, that means that critical race theory is an academic field. We pull on research methods from various fields, whether that be history, sociology, political science, anthropology, etc. We take all of those methods and we throw them into the pot, and we work out a research method that's interdisciplinary, that we're borrowing also from what these different areas find within their studies to help us inform our understanding of law. Transdisciplinary in that we transcend all of these disciplines, right? That it cuts through all of these disciplines and allows us to also understand the contributing disciplines in turn. So not only are other disciplines contributing to critical race theory is also contributing to other disciplines. And then it is also multidisciplinary as well, right? And now this is the key way in which you know that CRT is not taught at the K through 12 level. And the reason why it is not taught at the K through 12 level is, first of all, it requires a knowledge of law, whether that be property law, which we'll get into next week, whether that be torts, whether that be constitutional law, whether it be crim law, all of these different areas of law. A nuanced understanding is needed, along with the understanding of history, political science, sociology, anthropology. All of these areas fill in. This is why this is taken at the collegiate level, and it's typically taken at the grad school level or at the latter end of undergraduate study, because you have to have all of these different disciplines to help your understanding of CRT, but then you also need to take some classes over in the law school, right? If a law professor isn't offering it via another department, to have an understanding of law and how it relies on these disciplines and how they push and pull between one another. Okay, so there is that. Now, let's move on. Who is the founding philosopher of CRT? Here we look at Derek Bell, right? And I'm going to do a quick plug for his book here, right, which is Faces at the Bottom of the Well. We did not do any readings out of here because, you know, we would have to unpack a lot. And what I'm trying to do is just give you all foundations. But Faces at the Bottom of the Well by Derek Bell. Get this text. He relays his points through fictive stories. And some of you who enjoy novels, or just if you enjoy Octavia Butler type stuff, you will enjoy what he is doing in this text here. So Faces at the Bottom of the Well by Derek Bell. But who is Derek Bell? He's a Harvard law professor, right? So notice he is in a law school and he is teaching, but he is also a civil rights activist. Why? Because not only did he work for the U.S. Department of Justice, but he also worked for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. What this means is, sorry about that, you all. What this means is that he is not only talking about this from a theoretical point of view, he is engaging society and law from practice. And where does that practice come from? The NAACP in his time there, and what he did in the Legal Defense Fund, and how he found out law was operating. That becomes important. The difference between how law is written and how law is experienced matters. Right? And so Derek Bell is taking his knowledge of law, his teaching of law, and his application of law through practice, right? And it informs critical race theory. And as a matter of fact, some of your key critical race theorists, you will find out if you do their research backgrounds, they come out of Harvard and they studied under Derek Bell, right? So what are some other things that he did? He was key in desegregating schools in Mississippi. So we see that he is an activist. Not only is he in the courtroom, but he's also in the streets. He's not just talking from the ivory tower. He is applying this knowledge and he's seeing what is working. So it's not just theoretical. It's not just courtroom. It is also in the streets. So he's pulling all of these things together. And so what he did as a result of this is he grounded critical race theory in law, and a knowledge of law becomes essential to understanding critical race theory and what it is doing, because critical race theory is not just a type of class that you take, right? Even though one can take it as a course, critical race theory is also grounded in social justice. It is action oriented. Peep game, it is action oriented. So that is going to mean something to the nation state. We are dealing with an academic discipline that's not just about opening up a text and reading, but that prompts those who studies that particular field to be social justice oriented and to care about their neighbor and to take actions and steps, right, to remedy any discomfort or marginalization that may be taking place. More to come on that in a moment. But he established CRT as a departure from critical legal studies. And I'm going to move over to that now. But the whole point being here is that Derek Bell is the founding philosopher for critical race theory here in the States, and that particular wording will make sense in a little bit. So let's go further. Let's talk about these both the academic as well as the more social lineage of critical race theory, right? So now when we're talking about academic or within the academy, right? Remember, Derek Bell is establishing critical race theory as a departure from critical legal studies, okay? Now, I'm not going to go too far into this, but critical legal studies is informed by a number of early philosophers, whether it be Jeremy Bentham, John Locke, all of those wonderful people, right? Those minds come into critical legal studies. And critical legal studies is looking at feminism, is looking at postmodernism, is looking at all of these different areas, and it's saying law as it is written is also at the same time doing a type of harmful thing in these particular areas. Here's a tenet of CRT that you need to be aware of. What CRT is going to say is that as law is written, and this comes up out of critical legal studies, while it allows for a thing, it also disallows another. And as it disallows one thing, it also allows another. That is why you have various cases that come up before a court, because they are testing the law to see what the law will permit versus what it will not permit. So when you have a finding in one case, that finding will let you know, hey, these are the bounds. But if it's not explicitly mentioned, that means that that one thing is permitted, right? So out of critical legal studies, we get critical race theory. It moves to the next place, right? And these are all things that branch out from critical legal studies, right? You have feminism, race and law, postmodernism, economic law theory, etc., right? Because critical legal studies is doing its own thing, but these are four areas that really break out. Race and law is where critical race theory is centered, if you're looking at the diagram here, okay? And it will let you know right under the feminism, race, law, you see the diagram here, what each area goes through. But I won't go through each one of those for the sake of time. I'm just trying to give you the foundation for now, so that way you understand where critical race theory originates from and what its academic genealogy is. Now, that's within the ivory tower. Let's talk about these streets. Here you see where CRT fits in within social justice movements, particularly coming up out of the 60s and the 70s. These are things that Derek Bell would have seen, that he would have experienced, right? The sit-ins at the lunch counters, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, segregation in housing. These are all of the things that Derek Bell would have experienced. And out of that experience, Derek Bell begins to theorize critical race theory. It's not just necessarily to say that, okay, well, there's critical legal studies, you know, he saw some things there and then boom, critical race theory. Part of that is true, but what primarily informs Derek Bell is the experience of Black folk in the United States. So CRT, and how befitting that we're in Black History Month, but CRT is a part of the social justice intellectual history from Black folk folk in the United States. Just like there is a Black Power movement, there is a civil rights movement, there's Black Lives Matter, right? There is CRT. And CRT, again, is a type of academic work that has a social justice component to it. That's why when you meet folks like Kimberly Crenshaw, she is a part of that hashtag Say Her Name. When she's doing African American policy forums, she is out there talking about these issues, because it's not just classroom, it's not just theoretical, it's about how do you become action oriented. In other words, CRT is a call to action to bring about a more just society and to think about ways in which we can do that, right? And so some things ought to be turning over in your head right now as to why certain folks or certain nation states might have opposition to critical race theory. As a matter of fact, let's begin to lean into some of the key arguments of the field. So, what are some of the key arguments of critical race theory? Here we go. Key arguments in critical race theory is, number one, that race and racism are permanent and fixed necessary realities in the United States. Now, what does this mean? Before, folks freak out on me, right? What does that mean? It means that to the extent that borders are constructed, to the extent that Native peoples are living on unceded ground, to the extent that Black folk have been enslaved and built buildings and there's no conversation around reparations, all of those things, that race and racism are necessary in order to keep the nation state together. Sit with that. That's something to sit with. That is the primary tenet of CRT, that these are permanent fixtures, because it becomes impossible to say, well, this is the United States and Native and Indigenous folks are on these small pieces of land that we call reservations, right? And to the extent that we say, well, that's yours over there and the rest of this is the United States, that means that the U.S. would constitute a colonial power, right? And to the extent that the colonial power remains where it is, and Native folks remain where they are pushed onto those particular land areas, and I'm using Native and Indigenous folk as an example here, then we have a problem. Because then the actions of the state are indeed racist. And it becomes a necessary reality in order to hold the nation state together. Think about this, right? So long as one school must have all of these resources and another school doesn't have it, that becomes a necessary reality, right? These are things that we have to think about and we have to think through. And critical race theory takes a very strong look at these things. And that's going to become more important when we get into Cheryl Harris next week. But also, the arrangement of, we also, as critical race theorists, say that the arrangement of society is not happenstance. How we live among one another, relate to one another, understand one another, right? That the arrangement of society is not happenstance, but rather inequalities that are in society are conscious selections concerning the concerning the structuring of social relations. Had a little bit of a tongue twister there, right? That, in other words, to the extent that we understand Beverly Hills to be over here, Compton to be over here, and resources to be placed there, that is intentional. That what district receives what from what council person, those decisions are intentional. They're not just happenstance. That when schools in certain areas are underfunded, that's not happenstance. That was a decision. When certain city budgets all go to a certain department within the city, that's not a happenstance. That's a decision. And it lets you know the priority of the municipality or the priority of the nation state. And so critical race theorists are going to take a look at that and talk about how society is a social construction. None of this is happenstance, right? That society is operating as intended, right? The next thing that critical race theorists looks at is that race acts through various means as a way to exclude. These are key arguments in the field. Again, that race is not something that is neutral, but that it actually has a job to do within a socio-political setting and does a certain thing within society. In other words, race is a technology that does a certain thing that receives upgrades every few months, every few years, right? And folks can be integrated into one race, right? Whether it be from ethnicity, and there's a difference between race and ethnicity, but we're not going to get into introduction to sociology right now. And then can be removed. And then there's proximity to whiteness and all of these different things. But we are very clear about the fact that race acts through various means as a way to exclude, even down to who belongs to the group and who does not, and why that becomes important toward resources. And a key thing to have an understanding here of is, of course, capitalism. Because capitalism demands an underperforming other. Everybody cannot win in capitalism. That's just how that works. And so a critical race theorist is going to take a look at, well, how does race act through capitalism? And in turn, how does capitalism act on race? And how does capitalism animate race as a means to generate sustained inequality over both space and time? Lastly, a key argument in the field is that social institutions causes race, as well as other social designations such as gender, to matter, which results in social marginalization, discrimination, and the stratification of rights and social misrecognition, right? That institutions causes race to matter. Who are we talking about? Banks. Who are we talking about? Educational institutions, right? And if you go back and you read a wonderful book called The Color of Law, there's a book recommendation, right? It talks about how banks redline certain communities. It would not fund mortgages in certain communities. It would fund them in other communities, right? So how social institutions causes race to matter. In other words, that to the extent that race is a technology, that it is an invention, there has to be an interlocutor, if you will, that gives that technology meaning, that causes race to matter. Because otherwise it's just sitting out here and it's doing nothing. But within the polity, it has to do something, or within society, it has to do something. And it's up to social institutions to cause that thing to matter. Right? So now how does that relate to you? That means that when you are the HR manager, when you are the manager of the bank, when you are the manager of the store, or just a everyday employee, or even an educator, how you engage and treat folks matters. Because you, as a representative of the institutions, causes race to matter in a specific way. So an example, recently when the United States said, hey, we're no longer going to teach about the Tuskegee Airmen in this particular institution, that caused race to matter, because it said that particular part of Black history does not matter, because we do not see that as a critical part of United States history. And to the extent that that particular history of the Tuskegee Airmen did not matter, then those who reflect the Tuskegee Airmen also do not matter. Catch it? Right? So the particular ways in which social institutions causes race to matter. Okay, and we're pushing toward the end here. So why CRT matters to the nation state. And again, please remember, this is just a primer. This is just to get us set so that when we dive into the racial contract by Charles Mills on Wednesday, you understand where this is coming from. So why CRT matters to the nation state. First of all, de jure and de facto. That means de jure is law as it is written. De facto is law as it is experienced or lived, right? So de jure says that a cop should not do A, B, C, X, Y, Z, but de facto says, hey, this is actually what's happening in Black and brown communities, right? And CRT matters to the nation state because CRT exposes the difference between the two, because that is what we study. That is what we do publishing around, right? That is what we do social justice movements around. Again, Derek Bell was a civil rights activist who participated in school desegregation, right? Then we have the example of Kimberly Crenshaw would say her name in the African American Policy Forum, and there are so many others as well. But CRT, again, is not only in the classroom, but also in the streets. It exposes the chasm between de jure meaning law as it is written, and de facto, law as it is experienced. So you can put something on paper, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that is what you will experience, right? All right, and we're back. Sorry about that. There was a little adjustment with the camera, but nonetheless picking up where we left off. I'll be sure to adjust those settings in the future so that we don't have that disruption that takes place. But in either case, CRT exposes the difference between de jure and de facto, right? And it makes those things real. So what it also does, and the reason why it matters to the nation state, is that it has the capacity to map struggles across difference. In other words, it allows those who are of differing groups, whether it be along the lines of race, ethnicity, gender, sex, sexual orientation, whatever have you, to understand one another. And to say, hey, well, this is happening over here, that's happening over there. Let's do something about that. And what does that look like? CRT is uniquely positioned to map those struggles. And now what does that mean for the nation state? That means that the people within society, the people within the polity, right, understand that their struggles aren't against one another, that their struggles aren't horizontal, but that the struggle is vertical. And that is the power and capacity of CRT. And that is why it matters to the nation state and why the nation state would try to constrain it. Again, because it's not just about what happens in the classroom. It's about saying, okay, let's organize, let's do this, let's address this particular issue. And now that we understand one another and we're not fighting over resources, we can now have a conversation about what does it mean to do community organizing and come together and to understand that our struggles are not against one another, but that our struggle is vertical. That brings a new light to the term, we the people. It also pushes and challenges us to think beyond our own limitations. Because particularly in the US, we think about me, mine, and I, right? But CRT says that if I can look across here and understand how you are living, whether good or bad, and you can do the same thing, and that we care about how we live and exist with one another, and that we are trying to create a more equal union, then we have to do something about that. That's why Derek Bell was in the streets, right? And that's why it's incumbent upon us to understand what CRT is doing because it calls people to action, right? And this is why it matters to the nation state, because it takes material realities that people are living in every day and helps to communicate that across differences. And it starts to get real after that. So as we wrap up here, who are some key theories that you should be aware of? First of all, Devin Carbato, who is at UCLA, he studies race and policing through CRT. Then you have Kimberly Crenshaw, who a lot of you are familiar with, who looks at race and gender, who I've referenced a lot in this lecture. And then you have Angela Riley, who looks at indigeneity and government within critical race theory, right? So it's not just black folks, right? You got Native and Indigenous folks, right? You have Chicano folks, right? You have Latino folks, right? You have a lot of people that come in on critical race theory, right? But who are able to map their arguments via the work of Derek Bell and what he has laid out and the intellectual social justice history that he has left behind as a legacy, so that we can expose these particular areas of inequalities so that we can do something about them. And then there's Cheryl Harris, whose work we're going to dive into next week, who looks at race and society. So along those lines, what are some books that you may want to pick up to get a further understanding, right? Critical race theory. Everybody's probably seen this text, right? My particular copy is signed by Kimberly Crenshaw. Shout out to her. Thank you, Professor Crenshaw. But critical race theory, it is a key text. It says the key writings that formed the movement. Keyword, the movement. It is a movement, and it is one of the longest running movements since about the 80s up to now, right? So been here a long time. So you might want to check that out. And then, of course, we'll talk about this the last week in the course, but you might want to pick up critical race feminism, right? Which is a complement to this, right? Because typically when we talk about race, race is informed by gender, right? And so we have to understand that in the United States, you cannot understand race without gender. You cannot understand gender without race. So we have critical race feminism, right? That allows us to understand the particular experiences of women. So with that being stated, this is the foundation lecture. Okay, so now that you have the context of critical race theory, now we can get into the weeds starting on Wednesday with Charles W. Mills in the racial contract. And I'll tell you all now, pay very close attention to the first sentence that he starts off with. It's important. I'll see you all next time. Peace.